Karen Madison walked through life with an invisible crown that only she could see. To the rest of the world, she was just the manager of a mid-sized retail store, a woman in her early 40s with a penchant for beige suits and a voice that could curdle milk. But inside her own mind, Karen was the keeper of order, the defender of store policy, and the ultimate judge of character. She didn't just manage a store, she ran a kingdom. Her employees were not colleagues, but subjects to be molded or broken. Every refund, every minor inventory discrepancy, and every hesitant customer interaction was not just a business necessity, it was a personal challenge to her authority. Karen had spent her entire professional life mastering the art of weaponizing bureaucracy. She knew the store's policy manual better than her own home address, and she used it with the precision of a scalpel. If an employee made a mistake, she didn't offer guidance, she offered an audience. She thrived on the tension that rippled through the aisles whenever she stepped onto the floor. It was a specific kind of power, the power to make a teenager cry over a miscounted till, or to make a grown man feel small over an expired coupon. She didn't view herself as cruel, however. In her own twisted reality, she was simply maintaining standards. She believed that respect was something to be extracted by force, not earned through leadership. Her staff walked on eggshells, learning quickly that efficiency was their only shield. Customers, too, felt the shift in atmosphere the moment they entered her territory. There was a coldness to her smile that never reached her eyes, a calculated performance of professional etiquette that masked a deep driving need for absolute control. She was the queen of the complaint department, and she made sure everyone knew it. But control is a fragile thing, and Karen was about to learn that the more tightly you squeeze it, the faster it slips through your fingers. The stage was set, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken resentment, and Karen was looking for a target. It didn't take long for the universe to provide her with one. A simple $15 return was the match, and Karen was the entire powder keg, waiting for a reason to ignite. The incident didn't start with a bang, but with a simple, human falter. Leo, a 19-year-old cashier whose face still held the softness of adolescence, stood behind the register. His hands were visibly damp with sweat, a physiological response to the oppressive atmosphere Karen curated in the store. A customer, a woman in a nondescript coat, simply wanted a refund for a $15 item. It should have been a 30-second transaction, a routine dip in the day's ledger. Instead, it became a theater of calculated cruelty. Leo's fingers hovered over the pause screen, his mind momentarily blanking under the crushing, invisible weight of knowing Karen was watching from her vantage point near the office. He pressed the wrong key, a small error, a human error. That's when the rhythmic clicking of heels began a sharp staccato sound that signaled impending doom for anyone within earshot. Karen emerged from the back, her expression not that of a manager coming to aid a struggling subordinate, but of a general descending upon a battlefield to finish off the wounded. She didn't approach quietly. She broadcasted, "Is it really that difficult to read a manual, Leo?" Her voice cut through the ambient store music, instantly silencing the nearby shoppers. She didn't just correct him. She dismantled him. She pushed past him to take control of the register, her movements exaggerated, condescending, and performative. Every customer in line became a captive witness to her perceived superiority. She began to lecture, not on the nuances of customer service, but on his alleged lack of mental capacity. She turned a $15 transaction into a public referendum on his life choices and his future. The poor kid stood there, his face flushing from pale to a deep, agonizing crimson, his lower lip trembling as he fought to maintain a shred of professional composure. But Karen wasn't finished. She savored the discomfort of the room. She repeated the phrase, store policy, like a sacred, unbreakable law, ensuring that everyone within a 20-foot radius understood that she and only she held the keys to the kingdom. She thrived on the suffocating silence that followed, the way other customers averted their eyes, shuffling their feet in a desperate collective wish to be anywhere else. She was the star of this show, and the humiliation was the main act. She hadn't just corrected a refund process, she had systematically stripped a teenager of his dignity, and she wore that destruction like a polished trophy. She told herself she was being professional, maintaining the store's high standards, while in reality, she was meticulously sowing the seeds of her own inevitable, spectacular downfall. She was so blinded by the intoxication of her own power that she failed to notice the small black lens of the security camera mounted in the corner, silently recording every second of her malice. Karen didn't know the world was watching until her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. It started with a ripple, a notification here, a tag there. By the end of the day, it was a tsunami. The footage of her berating Leo, that poor, trembling boy, had been uploaded to a local community page by a bystander who had been standing just 2 aisles away. Within hours, it wasn't just local, it was national. It was shared, captioned, and analyzed by millions of strangers who felt an instant, visceral hatred for the woman in the beige suit. The internet, in its infinite efficiency, had already given her a name, the Retail Tyrant. Karen's reaction was not one of reflection. She didn't watch the video and see the cruelty. Instead, she watched it and felt a deep, burning indignation. She saw an edited version of the truth, she claimed. "They're cropping it," she told her bewildered husband that night, staring at the screen with eyes that had hardened into cold flint. "They aren't showing the context." To Karen, the context was irrelevant. She was the authority, and authority was absolute. She spent the next 48 hours scrolling through the vitriol, her thumb hovering over the screen of her phone like a weapon. The comments section was a graveyard of her reputation, but she refused to be buried. She saw her store's Yelp page plummet, her corporate headquarters sending stern, increasingly frantic emails, and her coworkers people she had spent years molding, avoiding eye contact in the break room. The final straw wasn't the shame, it was the loss of control. When her supervisor suggested a leave of absence to let things cool down, Karen heard it as a betrayal. To her, this wasn't a PR nightmare, it was a conspiracy. She had built her life on the pillars of rigid, unyielding policy, and now the world was judging her by the same standards she had applied to others. She couldn't accept that she was the villain of the story. She needed an arena where the playing field was level, where her truth could be debated, and where she could demand justice for the slight she felt she had endured. Her mind, warped by years of unchecked ego, latched onto a dangerous, delusional idea. If the world wouldn't give her the respect she deserved, she would force them to acknowledge it in the highest court of public opinion, the very same place where she had first been unmasked. She contacted a lawyer, not to apologize to Leo, but to sue the very show that had brought the incident to light. It was the ultimate irrational escalation, a desperate, clawing grab for the power she felt slipping away. She truly believed that if she could just get in front of a judge, she could explain away the footage and restore her shattered image. She was walking into a trap, convinced it was a staircase to her vindication. The lawsuit was filed like a declaration of war. Karen Madison, once a mere manager of a retail outlet, now perceived herself as a crusader for justice. She didn't want closure, she wanted vengeance. In her distorted worldview, this wasn't just a civil suit for emotional distress, reputational damage, or public humiliation. It was a high-stakes campaign to reclaim the crown that had been snatched from her head by a television judge. Her lawyer, a man whose expensive suit couldn't hide the predatory glint in his eyes, had happily accepted the case. He saw dollar signs in the form of a televised settlement from a network that wanted to avoid a PR disaster. He fueled her ego, whispering that she was the victim, that the court of public opinion was rigged, and that she deserved to be made whole. Karen transformed her home into a war room. Every night, she pored over folders, her mind fixated on the minutiae of the broadcast. She wasn't looking for her own faults. She was hunting for errors in the script. She annotated transcripts with aggressive neon highlights, convinced that the selective editing was proof of a calculated plot to destroy her. To her, every comment on social media, those digital darts thrown by millions of strangers, was an insult that needed to be legally avenged. She lived in a bubble of her own making, where her strict adherence to store policy made her a saint, and anyone who questioned her was a sinner. As the hearing date approached, she rehearsed her performance before the vanity mirror. She donned a tailored beige suit, designed to convey the image of a respectable, injured professional. She practiced her tone, firm, yet tinged with just the right amount of righteous indignation. She wasn't preparing to seek the truth. She was preparing a screenplay. She truly believed that if she could just face Judge Judy in a real courtroom, the scales would tip in her favor. She walked around her house with the calculated posture of a woman who had already won, unaware that the reality she was constructing was nothing more than a house of cards destined to collapse under the slightest gust of truth. She was a woman convinced of her own myth, walking blindly toward the one place where myths die instantly, the truth. The day of the hearing dawned crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Karen's mind. She marched into the courtroom with the stiff, practiced grace of a woman who believed she was about to deliver a masterclass in professional integrity. Her lawyer trotted beside her, clutching the meticulously organized folders that Karen had spent days curating. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a cocktail of righteous fury and absolute, unshakable confidence. She had her talking points, her highlighted transcripts, and her rehearsed expressions of dignified suffering ready to go. As she took her seat, she looked around the courtroom, not with nervousness, but with a predatory gaze, scanning for the moment she would turn the tables on the woman who had dared to mock her. Then, the doors opened, and Judge Judy entered. The room shifted instantly. The air felt thinner, sharper. Judy didn't look like a television personality. She looked like a force of nature, completely unimpressed by the spectacle. She took the bench, her gaze landing on Karen for a fraction of a second, a look that, to anyone else, would have been a warning, but to Karen, was merely an invitation to begin her presentation. Karen didn't wait for a prompt. The moment she was addressed, she launched into her polished speech. She spoke of dignity, professionalism, and the irreparable damage that the show had inflicted upon her reputation. Her voice was steady, practiced, and dripping with a manufactured sense of victimhood. She looked toward the gallery, imagining the sympathetic eyes she was sure were watching, and then turned to the bench with a look of wounded pride. "I am a manager who believes in standards," she declared, her posture rigid, her chin tilted at a defiant angle. "I was humiliated for simply enforcing store policy." Judge Judy listened in silence, her expression unreadable, almost bored. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fidget. She simply watched Karen with a steady, unflinching stare that began to make the air in the room feel heavy. It was a silence that Karen interpreted as rapt attention, but in reality, it was the sound of a trap about to snap shut. Karen, fueled by her own echo chamber, pressed harder, painting herself as a martyr for workplace efficiency. She was so wrapped up in the sound of her own voice, in the theater of her own defense, that she missed the minute narrowing of Judy's eyes. The judge had seen thousands of people like Karen, people who hid behind policies to bully others, and she was already 2 steps ahead. The performance was flawless, the script was perfect, but Karen was about to find out that in this courtroom, theater doesn't win cases, the truth does. And the truth was the one thing she hadn't prepared for. The courtroom was stifling, smelling faintly of floor wax and stale air, a stark contrast to the sterile, controlled environment Karen had envisioned for her victory. Judge Judy didn't look like a television star. She looked like a surgeon preparing for an amputation. Karen stood at the plaintiff's table, her folders spread out like a fan of cards, her beige suit perfectly pressed, her expression one of practiced, dignified suffering. Her lawyer, playing the part of the devoted defender, gave a sycophantic nod toward the bench, clearly expecting the judge to play along with the narrative. Karen began. She spoke of dignity, professionalism, and the irreparable damage that the show had allegedly inflicted upon her reputation. She painted herself as a martyr, a woman simply trying to uphold the sanctity of store policy in a world that had gone soft. She claimed the viral footage was a viciously edited hit job, a calculated attempt by the network to destroy her life for the sake of ratings. She was mesmerizing in her delusion, spinning a narrative where she was the hero, a misunderstood steward of order. She spoke with a rehearsed cadence, waiting for the inevitable moment when the judge would acknowledge her victimhood. Judge Judy, however, sat with her chin resting on her hand, her expression unreadable, almost bored. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fidget. She simply watched Karen with a steady, unflinching stare that began to make the air in the room feel heavy. It was a silence that Karen interpreted as rapt attention, but in reality, it was the sound of a trap about to snap shut. Karen, fueled by her own echo chamber, pressed harder. She highlighted her achievements as a manager, trying to pivot the conversation away from the teenage cashier and toward her own perceived excellence. She was so wrapped up in the theater of her own defense that she missed the minute narrowing of Judy's eyes. "So," Judy finally interrupted, her voice low but carrying the weight of a gavel, "your complaint is that the footage exists and people saw it?" Karen faltered, realizing the question wasn't the sympathetic opening she had scripted. "It's not that, Your Honor," she stammered, scrambling to regain her footing. "It's that it was taken out of context. I was managing. I was doing my job." Judy's eyes flashed that legendary, terrifying look. "Managing?" she repeated, her tone biting. "You were berating a child. You were power tripping. And you have the audacity to come into my courtroom to sue for emotional distress because the public didn't like what they saw? Karen's facade was beginning to crumble. She looked at her lawyer, panic finally starting to flicker behind her eyes. This wasn't the script. This was the mirror. And for the first time in years, Karen Madison was forced to look into it. The tension in the room was a living, breathing thing, tightening around Karen's throat. She was halfway through a sentence about misrepresentation when Judge Judy cut her off with a single, sharp gesture. It was a silencing motion, a command that froze the air. "Let's stop the theater, shall we?" Judy said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "You came here claiming your reputation was ruined by a doctored clip. You claim we fabricated a monster." Judy tapped the file on her desk, her gaze piercing. "But you see, in my courtroom, we don't deal in fiction, we deal in evidence." With a nod to the bailiff, the courtroom monitors flickered to life. The high-definition, unedited security footage began to play. There was no music, no dramatic voiceover, just the raw, sterile reality of that day in the store. The courtroom leaned in, eyes fixed on the screen as the true version of events unfolded. It showed Karen, not as the professional manager she claimed to be, but as a woman unhinged by her own ego. The footage captured her mocking Leo, the teenager, his visible distress as he tried to navigate the refund, and the absolute lack of empathy in her eyes. It was even worse than the edited clip that had gone viral. It showed her standing over him, hovering like a vulture, clearly relishing the moment she could make him feel like an embarrassment. Karen watched her own face on the screen, frozen. The color drained from her cheeks as the audio played, capturing her sharp, condescending tone. But the true gut punch was yet to come. Judy leaned forward, her expression hardening into something far more dangerous. "But wait, there's more," she said, her voice dripping with irony. "I have another recording. This one from your own phone, sent to a friend just days after the incident." The audio filled the room. It was Karen's voice, clear as day, laughing. "Attention is attention. People love a villain," she said in the audio, her tone flippant and arrogant. "I'll sue her. Keep the name in the headlines. If I can't be the best manager, I'll be the best story." The courtroom, previously tense, now erupted in a collective gasp. It was the sound of a reputation being incinerated in real time. Karen sat there, completely exposed. Her lawyer dropped his pen, his face turning an ashen gray. The narrative Karen had spent months building, that she was a victim, a martyr, a professional wronged by the media, hadn't just been challenged, it had been obliterated by her own arrogance. She was no longer a person fighting for justice. She was a woman caught in a lie she had spun herself. The silence that followed the end of the recording was the most damning evidence of all, the sound of her own hubris coming back to haunt her. The silence that followed the audio playback was absolute, a vacuum in the room where Karen's ego had previously expanded to fill every corner. She stood frozen, the beige suit no longer looking like an armor of professionalism, but a costume of delusion. Judge Judy leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Karen's with a clarity that felt like a physical blow. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. In a voice as cold and sharp as a winter blade, she delivered the line that would become the anthem of the entire ordeal. "You cannot sue people for showing the truth. You're not a victim of television, you're a victim of your own character." The gavel fell, not just on the case, but on the version of reality Karen had painstakingly constructed. The lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, and Karen was ordered to cover the entirety of the legal expenses, a financial sting that would haunt her for years. But the true punishment wasn't the money, it was the exposure. As she walked out of that courtroom, she didn't just walk out of a building, she walked out of the life she thought she deserved. Before she left, Judy offered one final, haunting observation. "Embarrassment isn't a punishment, Karen. Sometimes it's simply the mirror finally working." The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with the slow, agonizing erosion of her pride. Months later, the viral storm had settled into a steady, cold reality. Karen, no longer the manager of the retail store, found herself in a different environment entirely, a local community center. The transition was humbling. She wasn't the one barking orders anymore. She was the one listening to the grievances of others, helping to resolve disputes with a patience she never knew she possessed. One afternoon, she returned to the scene of her original crime, the retail store. She wasn't there to manage, she was there to ask for forgiveness. The teenage cashier she had once humiliated had since been promoted to assistant manager. When he saw her approach with a handwritten letter, His initial instinct was to recoil, but Karen stayed, her posture lacking the rigid authority of the past. She whispered the three words she had never spoken to anyone. I was wrong. The young man looked at her, seeing not the tyrant, but a broken, humbled woman. It's not hard to apologize, he replied quietly, a wisdom in his voice that far exceeded his years. What's hard is meaning it. That realization hit Karen harder than any courtroom ruling. In the end, the viral battle wasn't about revenge or winning a lawsuit. It was about the painful, necessary process of finally seeing herself clearly. The mirror hadn't just worked, it had finally cracked the shell of her arrogance, allowing the real person to breathe for the first time in a decade.